President of National Headquarters Dumbarton House, and on behalf of Alice Witcher, our National Museum Properties Chair, we are so thrilled you're all here. We've been talking about this meeting for 2 years, I know, and planning it, and it is just so wonderful to see such a great turnout from across the nation. In the advance packet, in your welcome bags, you received a short bio on our keynote speaker, Dr. Charles Bryan, but I would like to expand a bit. On this Veterans Day in particular, I am honored to introduce Dr. Bryan, who is a distinguished military graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He served 2 years active duty as an officer in the U.S. Army. He earned a master's degree in history from the University of Georgia and his Ph.D. from the University of Tennessee with a specialty in the American Civil War. For 2 decades, Dr. Bryan served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Virginia Historical Society, which was founded in 1831. Midway through his tenure, the American Association of Museums noted the transformation that had taken place under his leadership in an official report. Quote, "These achievements now place the Virginia Historical Society in the first rank of historical organizations in the nation. This is a notable achievement rarely matched in so short a time," unquote. Dr. Bryan was named President and CEO Emeritus when he retired, and the new education wing of the Virginia Historical Society bears his name. Dr. Bryan has had many honors bestowed upon him. He was selected as the Outstanding Virginian in 2009 and recognized by the Virginia General Assembly for his distinguished contributions, outstanding achievements, and inspiring leadership in service to the citizens of Virginia. He holds honorary doctoral degrees from the Virginia Commonwealth University and Randolph-Macon College. Both the Massachusetts Historical Society and the American Antiquarian Society, 2 of the nation's oldest learned societies, elected him to honorary memberships in recognition of his contribution to the history profession. In 2009, he received the Distinguished Service Award from the American Association of State and Local History for his extraordinary leadership in the field of public history. Last fall, Dr. Bryan spoke to members of our professional staffs at the inaugural Directors Roundtable held at Gunston Hall. The feedback we received was that every corporate society of the NSCDA needs to hear Dr. Bryan's message. We are honored that he has accepted our invitation to speak with us today and also present the topic of governance. Will you please join me in welcoming the delightful and charming Dr. Charles Bryan.
Now, my first challenge is to get this thing to work. Can you hear me?
Is it working? Yeah, okay. And we'll need to turn that one off. Anna, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I'm deeply honored to be here with you. One thing that was not mentioned was that after I retired, Dan Jordan, who is the retired director of Monticello, and I formed a consulting firm, Bryan and Jordan Consulting. We've had more than 50 clients in the nearly 5 years we've been in business. And I can truly say that Colonial Dames are I would say, at the top of our list of favorite clients, and I mean that sincerely. We had Wilton is our first client. People warned us, oh, those dames will eat you up. They were great. They did. Eva Bryson was on that committee. They did a wonderful job, and we hold them up as a model. And I know our 2 associates, David Crossan and Brent Glass, have done some work for Gunston Hall in the New York Dames, and they report the same thing. They're delight to work with. Now, another thing that Anna didn't mention, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 10 years ago. And I tell you that for 3 reasons. One, I try to create awareness of it, and we're creating a big Parkinson's center at DCU in Richmond. Second reason is if my hands get shaky, I'm not suffering from the DTs. And the third thing is that those of us who have Parkinson's, it takes us longer to do things, to get dressed, get in and out of a car. It takes me an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes now. And this, Anna, was an hour-long talk. It's up to 3 hours now, so fasten your seatbelts. Well, what I want to do is suggest a way to make your house museum more relevant. And this is something I talked at Gunston Hall last year, and I made a few changes in it. But before I start, I want to ask you a question. And you don't have to answer this out loud now, but we'll come back to it in the course of my remarks. Now think for a second. Who was the best teacher you ever had? Who was your favorite teacher? This could be college, high school, middle school, grammar school, whatever. Doesn't have to be history. It could have been, God forbid, chemistry or... but who was your favorite teacher? That's question number one. And question number two, what were the characteristics that made that teacher so good? Now think about that for a few minutes, and we're going to come back to that. But I really don't need to get into a long litany about the struggles of house museums in America. As a matter of fact, I think many of you may have seen an article in the Washington Post earlier this year about the problems facing house museums in America. It was a fairly extensive article, and was, I think, surprised a lot of us when it came out in the Post. And it reported that all over the country, house museums, the visitation numbers are down, revenue from earned income is down, charitable giving to these organizations is declining to some extent. There's evidence of that. And some of that reflects the changing patterns of giving among this new generation of charitable givers. That they're more interested in social services, the environment, and actually arts and culture and the humanities is declining to some extent. It also reported that many of these house museums have little or no endowment. So there are serious financial problems. And it also reported that even before the Great Recession, some of these house museums were experiencing problems. And the Great Recession only exacerbated the situation. So it wasn't a very pretty picture that it painted. And there are other things that were not mentioned in that article. Because of the hard times, it's led to a significant amount of staff turnover, particularly on the curatorial level. The salaries that we're able to pay are not great, and so there's a lot of turnover. It makes continuity a problem with many of these places. And let's face it, many of these house museums don't have boards that can address these challenges very well. They have difficulty raising the money. We give a quiz called Show Me the Money Quiz, and we have a number of questions about fundraising in America. The last question is, which would you rank in order, which of these you would most want to do? One is have a root canal. Two is sit next to a person, an obnoxious dinner guest at a dinner party. Sit in the middle seat next to a screaming child on an overseas trip. Be asked for money or asked for money. And if people put ask for money as last, we know there's a problem. That board does not like to raise money. So that's a problem. Some boards are dysfunctional, and many have factions that are destructive. When we worked with Wilson, we did an organizational chart, and we put up here what we call a parking lot committee. Are you familiar with a parking lot committee? This is a group of board members that go out in the parking lot after the board meeting, and we're not going to do this. And it's riven with factions, and that can be destructive. And also, many house museums have very narrowly focused missions that make it difficult to prove their worth in their communities. And we always ask our clients this question when we get ready to do a strategic plan. If for some reason your house museum or your organization were to go out of business next week and never reopen, would it make any difference, and would anybody care? And if your answer is, we're not sure how much difference it would make in our community, or not that many people would care, you have some work to do. Because you do want to make a difference, and you would like for people to care about what you're doing. So, although we're seeing a change in approach among some house museums, we still see lots of them that the collections are the story, rather than as a means to tell a bigger and more relevant and important story. Let me repeat that. They see their collections as the story rather than as a means to tell a bigger and more relevant story. And many of these, the tours of these museums are collection centered. And the visitor's attention is drawn to the object they see on tour. I'll talk about this later, about history grows with age. I gave you a little chart. And I found in my studies that people's interest in history suggests that the public interest in object-centered interpretation is waning. And it's a question I've asked people, and I'll come back to that later. And I think we're seeing the numbers going down because the public is less interested in what house museums have to offer. And part of that relates to choices. Now people, all of us, have so much to choose from to fill our leisure time compared to previous generations. Now think for a minute, when did your house museum, when did your property open up as a public attraction? Say it was 1952. Well, think of the options that people had in 1952 to fill their leisure time as compared to today. And I think about that a lot. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. But in, say, 1952 as compared to today, well, for one, there are more than twice as many museums in this country than there were then. The number of museums in the United States nearly doubled in the last quarter of the 20th century. It is estimated that there are approximately 20,000 history museums and historic sites in this country, and about half of those are house museums. And as a result of that, the museum audience has been diluted by so many choices. And then you think of other ways to fill your leisure time. Television, for example. When I grew up in a small town in Tennessee in the 1950s and 60s, we received 3 channels. One of them we barely received, Channel 8 from Nashville. But today, on cable, you have hundreds of channels. And if you want to access history on television, you can do it. It's available all the time. And then we take our little handheld devices and iPads and PCs, whatever. History is available to us. I gave my wife an iPad last year, and Candy's the love of my life of going on nearly 45 years, but I'm getting jealous of that iPad. She seems to spend more time with that than as to say, I'm getting jealous. And so people are glued to the tube in many other ways. And you take theaters. I grew up in a small town, McMinnville, Tennessee. We had one theater, the Park Theater, which showed one movie, and it changed about every 2 or 3 weeks. Now, in my little town, they have a theater that has 5 screens that changes movies every 2 or 3 times. So there's something new to go to all the time. When I was growing up, there were no amusement parks that we had scattered around the country like we do today. And then one other thing, travel. Again, growing up in the 50s and 60s, people, if you travel, you went to see relatives. The cruise industry, that was only for a handful of people, and they crossed the Atlantic. The cruise industry, as a matter of fact, Colonial Williamsburg, their numbers continue to go down. They say one of their big competitions for family travel is the cruise business. There's something like 150,000 staterooms and cabins available on cruise ships now. And they can put together wonderful packages. And that's something that we didn't have to worry about in 1952. So with the phenomenal growth, and there's one other thing I mentioned, and I bet some of you are affected this way. Young families with young children, what are they doing on the weekends? Are they going to museums? No, they're going to soccer tournaments, Little League. I mean, this organized sports has come into its own in our time. And that's real competition. So there is just the competition alone for people's leisure time. And what are we offering, and how can we compete with that? It's not easy. Then I want to talk about change in culture. Formality versus informality. And when you think about it, today we live in an age of informality. People dress, they act and dress to a greater degree of informality than ever before. And I never cease to be amazed at what some people wear or don't wear in public. And it runs counter to what many house museums represent when you think about it. Most of your houses represent formality in what they display and what they interpret. And take, for example, the parlor and the living room. I would venture to say that every one of your historic houses has a living room or parlor and a formal dining room. You realize that in the last 2 decades, 3/4 of the houses built in the United States did not have a formal dining room or living room in them.
They've been replaced by the family room or a den. They don't have a formal dining room or a formal living room. And we see that also affecting the habits of young adults. They are less, I know this is true of my children, they're less interested in formal entertaining and the things that go with it. And if you look at the sales of place settings, silverware, crystal, that kind of thing, that has gone down. It's not what it was 20 and 25, 30 years ago, or when your house museum opened up. And people have a much more casual attitude in that regard. Then there's what I call the brown furniture phenomenon. And up until the 1980s, Americans furnished their homes with brown furniture. Bedrooms, living rooms, dining rooms, almost every corner of the house was furnished much the same way for generations. The Ethan Allen look or the mahogany look. But as tastes changed, they also shifted in house furnishings. And young adults wanted furniture that was non-traditional. And fewer wanted hand-me-downs. And so with no more formal living rooms or dining rooms furniture, they began to shift to a different type, away from brown furniture. And I know I had a death in the family in Jackson, Mississippi, and I stayed with my niece. She's in her 30s. There's no traditional brown furniture, and she's done very well, and her home is not furnished the Ethan Allen way. So is your house museum full of brown furniture? And are most of your visitors what I would call brown furniture people? That is, people of a certain age. And what does that mean when the brown furniture generation is replaced by the IKEA generation? Now, it doesn't mean you've got to go through and get rid of all your brown furniture and replace it with IKEA, but I hope you can see there is this disconnect of trying to make what you do relevant. Now, people have choices. And people can choose to come to your house museum or not. And in that respect, I think all house museums, all museums are an elective. They are an elective. They can elect to come to your house or house museum or not. And I use this as an analogy to when we were in college. It's not like electives we took when electives we took when we were in college. As you know, most of us, after our freshman year, you could start choosing courses that you wanted, electives. And what went into your decision making? Well, there were a lot of factors that went into what I did. I avoided those courses that were said to be boring. And I tried to stay away from those that were taught by professors who were holy terrorists, uncaring, or insufferably arrogant. I tried to take those that I thought I would get a decent grade in. And I also chose them by maybe this will help me get a job after I graduate. But I think more often than not, I tended to choose them based on who the professor was. And if he or she was known to be dynamic, it was a great class, I tended to sign up for it. And I think that would be true for most of us. It was the professor that drew me to the class. And this is relating to what I asked you at the beginning. I write a monthly column for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And I wrote one earlier this year called What Makes Great Teachers Great? And I interviewed a number of people, David McCullough, who's an old friend of mine, and the former governor of Virginia, a whole list of people. And I said, tell me, who was the best teacher you ever had? And David McCullough talked about a professor he had at Yale. I said, what made him so good? Now I'm going to open this up for discussion. Just see, how many of you thought of who your favorite teacher was? Did ever? All right, tell me some characteristics of what made that teacher so good. Just
told a good story.
Told a good story. Yes.
The subject was history and made history relevant to the times that we were in.
Okay. Made history relevant, yes.
Working knowledge of the subject, great people skills.
Okay, personality, working knowledge of this subject. Anything else? Okay.
Taught outside of the classroom, field trips.
Oh, that's good. Taught outside the classroom with field trip. Very innovative in it. Yes.
This was a third grade teacher
And outside, what she brought from her life experiences to us, let us choose a language, a foreign language to learn in class, so that outside experience that she brought in.
She opened your eyes to a world that you did not recognize. Yeah. Right. Let's take two more and then, okay.
Was interested in me. You know, she
Very good.
reached out to me.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. In the back, and we'll.
Challenged me to think and question.
Very good. Hey, you could have written that article for me. Much of what you say reflects what I heard from these other people, and let me share with you. I came up with 7 characteristics that make for a great teacher. And let me share those with you, and as I say, they reflect in what you had to say there. 1, they sing everyone, whether it was chemistry, math, God forbid, history. I'll tell you a true story. I went to VMI and I took, I was a history major, but you had to take all this science. And I flunked math and chemistry my first year there. And in the meantime, I had to come back to summer school, and I met a beautiful young woman. We started dating and we got married. Her father was the math professor who flunked me. True story. He gave me the grade book for my 40th birthday for the class. But here they are. They seem to genuinely love the subjects they teach. And that love is contagious, and it carries over to their students in the classroom. You just get that. This guy or gal really loves the subject, and it's contagious. You just can sense it. And they are enthusiastic, they're energetic, as you said. Their classes are vibrant, and the professors actively engage their students in discussion. They just don't stand up there and drone on. It's a two-way street. And they, as you pointed out, they challenge your assumptions. They make you think analytically and critically. And you often hear students say something like, I hated history. I had the football coach in high school, and he made it so deadly dull, but I took his course, and after that course, I had a whole new attitude about history, and I love it now. And a powerful professor can do that. 2, and this is something you pointed out, they know their subject well, and they keep up with the current scholarship, the latest information that has come out, and you won't find dog-eared or yellowed notes in their class. You remember those professors, you could tell they've been using the same thing year after year after year. But they're really good professors. They were constantly challenging, and they'd read an article and they would share that with their students. Have you thought about such and such? So they're fresh in what they teach. 3rd, early in the class, they gain and understand who their students are and develop a rapport with them. I remember I had one professor, I never will forget this, who the first day he would go down and he'd have you give out your name, and he had some trick, and I don't know what it was, but he could remember your name. And that impressed, not that every visitor comes to your museum, you got to remember their name, but that really impressed me that he knew who I was. And when I went into his class, I know he knew who I was. I wasn't just a number. And I knew that I had to perform well, but he had that ability to connect with his students. And I think that's an important characteristic. 4th, they are creative in their approach to the subject matter. And they help students look at things from a different perspective, and they turn light bulbs on in people's heads. I said, I get it. I never thought of it that way. That is so interesting. And it gave me a new perspective on something that I had assumed all my life, and that is absolutely fascinating. I want to go learn more about it. And great teachers have that ability. 5th, many of them, as a matter of fact, I would say most of them, are not easy teachers. They give challenging assignments. They can be hard graders, and that's often their trademark. And they keep their students on their toes, and they do not pander to them. They don't come in and say, what do you want? They have a good sense of what it is they want to teach. And they help you, and sometimes being challenging in their teaching to help you learn. 6, in one way or another, as somebody pointed out, they make their subject relevant. And students can see a connection to their own lives and the world around them is brought forth through this professor. They somehow, and you think about, to me, best preachers give sermons that are relevant to me today. I shouldn't say this, but Eva Bryson, we go to the same church. When somebody gets in and just preaches strictly from the Bible, I find that less interesting unless he or she tells a parable relating to my life. And so somehow there needs to be a connection to our own lives. And seventh, this is an important one, they have credibility. They have credibility, and there's a strong trust factor that what he or she is telling me, I can accept. And if he says this is going to be a hard exam, whatever, there's a strong trust factor, and there's credibility relating to it. Now think about this. Those characteristics should apply to your house museum as well. Your house museum should be a great teacher, and you should be a great teacher. And let me just run through those very quickly again. When you have people come to your house or come to your website, it needs to be obvious. These people love what they're doing. There's a real love and excitement for the history they're trying to interpret here, and you can tell they're passionate. It always makes it much more interesting. And you know, we've all been on those tours where the person has done it for 1,000 times, and it's and that is a real turnoff. So there needs to be a demonstration of love and genuine enthusiasm for what they're doing for the house they're interpreting. You need to know your subject well, and you need to keep it fresh. I did an accreditation visit for a museum in Kansas a few years ago, many years ago. And I went in, and the introductory label, it was a county history museum, and it was named for a Civil War general. And in the introductory, I know my Civil War history fairly well, I saw a mistake in the introductory label. It was fairly plain, and I pointed it out. And of course, as soon as I saw that in the introductory label, that colored mind, you know, if they make this mistake, and it's a fairly blatant mistake, in that label, what else am I going to see? And then I found a few more. The inexcusable thing is, 2 years later, I came back. And so much for listening to me, it was still there. And so you must make sure that what you say, you know, your scholarship, your interpretation is accurate, and that you keep it fresh. That if some new information comes out, you try to share it, just like the good professor. You develop a rapport with your visitors. One thing we recommend to house museums, places that do tours, first thing the guide or docent needs to do is, why did you come? Ask them why they came. And where are you from? And what, do you know anything about what we're trying to do here? Just engage, and the couple will say, we're from Texas. And so the docent taking the person through knows if there's a Texas connection somehow to the house, you can point that out. But it's a way of connecting with your group. And just ask, you know, ask them questions. And I guarantee you, if you ask them why they came and how they found out about it, that can be free, useful marketing information. But it connects you with your visitors. And so try to engage them early on. Fifth, you know, I talk about the many great teachers are difficult. Well, I don't propose that you make the visitor experience difficult. But one thing is they don't pander to their students. And I think a lot of museums have fallen into the trap that we'll do what the public wants. And the focus groups are great, and they're wonderful. But you should have a certain idea of what it is you're trying to interpret and try to impart. And you don't have great professors coming in the first day of class, and what do you all want to learn in this semester? They have a good sense, and you need to as well. Your story needs to be relevant. The story that and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. You need to have a story that is in somehow relevant and relates to their lives, to your visitors' lives. And then last, you must have credibility. You must, and again, the information is credible as much as possible. Well, those 7 characteristics, as I say, should apply to museums. They're the right thing to do, and I think they can make your museum a more attractive elective. Now, I'm going to carry this education theme a little farther with you this morning. And perhaps it's time for museums, particularly house museums, Just start thinking of themselves as educational institutions. You're more like a school and you're more like a college. And if you're a board member of one of these institutions, think in terms of overseeing a college or a secondary school rather than a museum. Now, you can't forget you're a museum, but think of yourselves now as more of an educational institution. And if you do that, you can see a lot of similarities. If you're serving on the board of college or a university, of course you worry things, I mean, you don't worry, I hope you don't worry, but we do, about budget, personnel issues, strategic planning. But you also are involved in helping plan the curriculum, in what it is you want to teach. And I think that same principle should apply to house museums. And I want you to start thinking of your visitors as your students, and that you have specific goals of what you want them to learn. Therefore, I suggest that you follow the example of those great professors and apply their principles to your museum. And think of your museum as a classroom. And if you have property surrounding it, it becomes a campus. And that campus can be a great teaching opportunity for you. Well, what is your subject? What are you going to teach? What do you want your students to learn? And what is the takeaway? I was talking to some of you last night. Have you thought about it? When people come to your house museum, what do you want them to come away having learned? And I think a lot of museums don't really think that through. And you should establish some criteria to say, everybody who comes to this house museum, we would like for that person to have learned these two or three things. Another way to put it is that blank museum is the go-to place for fill in the blank. We're the go-to place for what? And I'll explain that a little more. And you need to think about that. It's even a condensed version of the so-called elevator speech. But what is the takeaway? Well, let me share some examples of 3 museums that have changed their focus to a broader and more relevant interpretation. One is in Indianapolis, and that's the Benjamin Harrison House, which I know Karen went to. Benjamin Harrison will not go down as one of our great presidents. There's just no way around it. But the Benjamin Harrison House was a typical house museum where people went through and learned about Benjamin Harrison. And that was well and good. But they decided that we needed to do more. And one of the things that they not discovered, but they realized about Harrison was the importance of public service. Public service is a backbone of the American democratic experience. We're unique to some extent, that we have voluntary organizations, 501c3s, where people work and don't get compensated for it. It's part of being a citizen, part of a participating citizen in a democracy. So part of their new interpretation is how we as Americans and how public service is an important component of what we do. They do seminars and programs, and it's been very successful. It's a whole new approach, and so they were very creative and imaginative about that. So there's a house museum example. Another interesting example of transforming itself is the Strong Museum in Rochester, New York. Margaret Woodbury Strong was an heir of the Eastman Kodak fortune. She had tons of money. And she spent her life collecting dolls. I mean, tens of thousands of dolls. And when she died, she left that doll collection in $50 million to create a museum of dolls. And so you go, and if you were interested in dolls, you were happy, but it didn't have much appeal to people beyond dolls. Well, about 15 or 20 years ago, they hired Raleigh Adams as their new director, and they went through this whole new exercise and decided, how can we possibly reach a broader public? It is now the Museum of Play. And when you think about it, play is, we laugh, but it's an important, and they trace how play has changed through time. How did colonial children play? How did play change in the 19th century with the coming of industry? And in the 20th century, when you had Barbie dolls, and when I had Mattel pistols and that kind of thing. And they have a very serious scholarly journal, the Journal of the History of Play, and it's a form of popular or legitimate cultural history. And their visitation has quintupled since they taken in that new interpretation. Now they have a Toy Hall of Fame, which if you're ever up there, you'll go in and you'll see toys from your youth. And it was an interesting way of taking a narrowly focused subject and making it much broader. The third example is my old institution, the Virginia Historical Society, which when I came in 1988 was simply a library, a scholarly research library. We drew about 5,000 people a year. And the stories were that a school bus would drive up in front of the Historical Society, the teacher would get off to bring the students in. They said, well, sorry, you know, once you go next door, there's a very nice art museum next door. There's a nice museum downtown. The teacher would get on the bus and they would drive away. You don't want to disturb the scholars. Fortunately, the board of the Virginia Historical Society decided they wanted to change. And they wanted to open the place up. And I was lucky enough to be the one hired to help lead that effort. And we did. And so we had to come up with something that would be a legitimate, to fill a legitimate need. And it was this. Why is Virginia, of all states, one of the few not to have a state history museum? All of Virginia history under one roof. We had Colonial Williamsburg, Monticello, Mount Vernon, but it was just one aspect. And teachers said we would want to have a museum where we could bring our students in and we could do colonial and Civil War and 20th century all under one roof. And we said we can do that. So we went to people and said, you know, we need this. Tennessee has one, Kansas has one, even West Virginia has one. And that really got them. And it was a legitimate need, and we did it, and teachers loved it because this was the only place in Virginia they could do it all under one roof. So we took a whole new look at what it was we were trying to do. And as I say, the rest is history. And I might mention that the big permanent exhibit, or long-term exhibit we set up was The Story of Virginia, an American Experience. The Story of Virginia, an American Experience. And I want to talk a little bit about this because what you do in your house museum is an American experience. That's one of my favorite television programs for the last several years. PBS is an American Experience. They're wonderful programs. And when you think about it, what you do is an American experience. And that's what I would like for you to think about as your takeaway. And let me make a suggestion or two. I'm on the board of the Smithsonian's Museum of American History, and we're going through, and it's a great museum. But if you go to the Smithsonian's American History Museum, it's a little of this, a little of that, and there's no narrative. And we're trying to come up with the idea of some place in that you can walk through and get the full sweep of American history. And I've pointed out that what they're trying to do at the Smithsonian is teach the Survey American History course in half a day, or at most a full day. Most visitors come there for half a day, or a full day. How could you possibly teach the full scope of American history in that short of time? It's not impossible, but I say, well, we just don't have a mishmash. And I've come up, well, do something like 10 things that everyone should know about the United States, or take 100 objects, and each object reflects some period in history. But to come up with some kind of narrative, that you will be the only place, that you will be the classroom for American history. Well, let's turn to your museum now. Rather than doing the traditional house museum tour, think in terms of teaching an elective in American history, an upper level course. And your charge is to fit your house museum into the overall context of American history or your state's history. And think about it for a few seconds. In what way does your house museum help us understand American history? And how and when, and how and why is that important for us to learn? Now, every house museum has a personal story to tell. A family, a prominent individual, maybe a significant event. And you have a bigger story to impart. And I think it would help if you learned as much as you can about that bigger story. Read about it, confer with historians from a nearby college or university, and I think you can develop a meaningful story to tell. Now, what about your collections? Do we forget this? No. Think about this. Your collections are your great teaching tools. And that makes you a classroom and a course that no professor can possibly have available to them. You have wonderful teaching tools, and they can be the center of attention for your tours. You don't ignore them, you put them to good use. And imagine doing a class in colonial history. When a professor can talk about the disparities of trade between Great Britain and the United States and the Stamp Act, if you have British colonial furniture, you can tell the story of how that was imported. And then as things begin to cut back, we had to produce our own furniture, our own silver. Think about a professor lecturing on life in the early 19th century, or late 18th century. When the time that George Washington died, do you know what the average lifespan of an American was? 25 years. That's if you average all births and deaths. In the year 1800, for every 1,000 babies born in the United States, 400 did not reach adulthood. Now, why is that? Well, children were born at home. There was no sanitation. You go into the kitchen, they didn't understand germs or whatever. The ways of teaching using the current rooms and objects that you have. A group comes through in the summertime. And of course, most of your sites, I would imagine, are air conditioned. But most are not. Great, that's even better. That's even better. How did people cope? How did people cope with the heat in the summertime? And you talk about how they dressed. I don't know if you do that. Or in the wintertime, how do they stay warm? And you think about that. Many of these homes represented upper class families. But the life was hard. One of the great things about the series on John Adams that was produced on HBO a few years ago, that he was one of the most prominent Americans. Life was hard. A simple paper cut could turn into an effect. You know, it was tough. And it's relevant for people to see that your lives there's a connection, but in many ways they're so very different. So use that as an opportunity to tell a much bigger story. Now, if you make these changes, if you somehow do a whole new interpretation and make your house museum an elective, a course in American history, does this mean that your visitation will increase dramatically? Will the money come rolling in? I can't say yes. I really can't. But I can tell you that based on my experience at the Virginia Historical Society, you can begin to persuade foundations and corporations and a number of individuals to support this new endeavor because it is more relevant than what you have been doing. And as I say, this is something that served us well at the Virginia Historical Society and working with teachers. And it's interesting that since I've retired, the VHS is free. Now, we charged admission. They've gone free. And one of the trustees said, I believe so strongly in what you're trying to do here that I'm willing to put up the money to cover the cost of admissions. I'm not sure that's going to happen at every place, but that was a wonderful thing to happen for them. But let me close this, and then I'll open it up for some questions. What do you think your takeaway should be? And you can be the go-to place for what? And I would urge you to think in terms of your house museum as you are an American experience. And you could have an absolutely fascinating and relevant story to tell. And so, Wilton House, an American experience. What will I learn about the American history by going there? And I think that will not only be more interesting, it will be relevant to your visitors. And I would hope that you all would embrace that concept because you all have the potential to be great teachers. And you want to have that reputation of a house museum that is a great teacher. So, thank you very much.